Okay, welcome to another episode of Critical Weight Theory. And this episode starts with a moment from daytime television. During an appearance on The View, Arnold Schwarzenegger was there to promote his Netflix series titled FUBAR, but the conversation quickly shifted to immigration, and what he said sparked a lot of debate. Arnie argued that immigrants should behave like a guest in the United States, and his point was simple on the surface. If you're entering someone's home, you follow the rules, you act respectfully, you contribute, you don't take advantage, and all that kind of stuff. So he even framed it like hosting people for dinner. If someone invites you in, you don't make a mess or disrupt things. You show gratitude and, you maybe take your shoes off at the door if they have that as a house rule or whatever. It's a metaphor that sounds familiar, maybe even intuitive, but it's also where things start to get complicated if you let reality actually set foot into the house. So, because immigration is not the same as visiting someone's house, and that's exactly where the critics pushed back. During the discussion, host Joy Behar pointed out something pretty important. Schwarzenegger himself is an immigrant. He was born in Austria, moved to the US in 1968, and eventually became a citizen. I know what some people would immediately say. They would be like, well, he came here legally. That's different. Well, I'm going to get into that a little bit more. All right, so just hold your horses on that one. But his life story is often held up as proof of what's possible. Work hard, follow the rules, succeed. And, if you've got a vision, you can bring it to life like you know, a true American hero or something like that. But that story did not happen in a vacuum. Arnold arrived during a very specific moment in U.S. history. After the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1968, the system shifted away from explicit racial quotas, but it still prioritized certain kinds of migrants. Family connections, specific skills, and of course, if you were well off financially, you would probably have an easier time getting into the country. And people who fit what the system was looking for had an easier time getting here. In other words, not everyone had the same path available. So when we talk about doing it the right way, we have to ask who actually gets that option, right? So Arnold also emphasized, did I say emphasized? I meant emphasized. He emphasized legality. His argument was that entering outside legal channels will hurt both the country and the individual. But that idea skips over a key issue. Legal pathways are actually limited, especially for low wage workers. At the same time, entire industries in the United States depend on that sort of labor. Agriculture is a clear example, really the most often cited, and for decades, farms have relied heavily on migrant workers, many of whom have unstable or undocumented status. And of course, the restaurant industry has a similar thing going on sometimes as well. So there's a contradiction here in this dynamic. The economy depends on these types of workers, yet the system kind of trashes them and makes it hard for them to, travel freely and enter the country legally. And the system depends on migrant labor, but it seems to go out of its way to restrict how that labor can legally arrive. So basically, right wingers or right wing ideology are a big chunk of what makes this really an issue. And of course, if people are fleeing conflicts and wars and discrimination and all kinds of stuff like that, political persecution, any number of things, well, They're going to go wherever they can to maybe stand a fighting chance. And then there's the question of contribution that was raised by Arnie. Arnie suggested that immigrants should give back even without pay, and he said it's like a kind of repayment for opportunity. But many already do contribute in a very real and measurable way. Undocumented workers, or illegals as right wingers like to call them, they pay billions in state and local taxes every year. They support industries. They sustain local economies, often without access to those same benefits that citizens would get. So the idea that immigrants need to earn their place can feel to some like ignoring what's already happening. They already should be, in some ways, earning their place just like anybody else. But there are these intentional systemic hurdles in many cases. There's also a deeper layer to this conversation, one that goes beyond individual behavior. Focusing on personal responsibility misses the bigger picture. Migration is not just about one's own personal choices, it can be shaped by larger forces, and quite often is. Trade agreements, for example, have played a role. The North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, reshaped parts of the Mexican economy. Small farmers struggled to compete, and many were pushed to leave their land. Some of them migrated north. So when people say, why don't they just stay and fix their country? It leaves out how global systems are connected. It's a thing that's bigger than just one country because we have a global economy. And that is in many ways thanks largely due to right wing ideology and the corporate nature of the economy that right wingers love so much. The simple fact is we are all connected in one way or another, and it's both an unnerving fact, but also potentially a solution. It's a frame of reference for how we can possibly uh, move past these problems that we've created for ourselves over the decades. Well, not just decades, but centuries, really. And from another perspective, especially in anarchist theory, that's a word that you're not supposed to bring up in serious circles, but I'm doing it here. But anyway, in anarchist theory, the entire idea of borders is questioned. If no one truly owns land in a moral sense, then who gets to decide where someone can live and work? And in that view, calling immigrants guests it assumes that the state has a legitimate right to control movement, and that's exactly what's being challenged by reality, not just radical ideology, but reality itself is challenging the legitimacy of these systems that want to sort of divvy out the rights to who can travel where and for what reasons. You know, like I've said, if you're a rich person, borders don't matter as much. You can more freely travel around the world, and it's a bit of a simple thing for you. But if you're non-rich, well, then you face a lot of extra hurdles that you might have a challenge getting over. And now you can call this a utopian vision here that I'm going to lay out. Um, and you can dismiss it if you want, but personally I like the idea of people being able to relatively easily travel around the globe, not just as a tourist necessarily, but to maybe live and work for a little while. And, if they like it enough, they could stay, or maybe they could travel. I know some people already do this. I'm not saying it never happens. But I just would like a world where that's way more easy to do, just travel around. And I don't see anything particularly wrong about that. You might say that's dangerous or whatever, but in reality, it's actually the case that the world is dangerous as it is. So, I mean, no matter what you do, you're taking a gamble. If you stay home, you're taking a gamble. Something could go wrong in your house. You might feel safe and secure by just staying in your home, locking your door, staying inside your own neighborhood or whatever. But, danger has ways of finding you pretty much wherever you are. Not to induce paranoia in your mind or fear, but it's just kind of true. So, there are reasons to go out and explore the world, and it should be easier to do that. And, that's, I guess, my utopian vision, although to me it just seems like a common sense kind of thing. And there's also the idea of what some call the hierarchy of mobility. Not everyone moves through the world equally, like I was kind of suggesting here. Highly skilled workers often have more freedom to cross borders. Well, then again, I mean, calling them all highly skilled is, it's let's just face it, it's more about just their status. If you're born to a rich family, then you can more easily travel around. you know but if you've got investors, executives, professionals, whatever you want to call them, their movement is encouraged. Meanwhile, people fleeing poverty, instability, or displacement will face more restrictions, possibly detention, or just exclusion. And morality becomes you know hard to come by if you just don't even have a fighting chance. So, I mean, what are you going to do then? You're you're stuck in a rotten situation. So mobility becomes a privilege, not a right. And then there's labor. Migrant workers are often described as flexible, but that flexibility can mean something else in practice: lower wages, fewer protections, less stability, and in most cases, being being a poor person creates conditions where exploitation is easier. And all of this feeds into a system where migration isn't just a personal journey, it's part of a global economic structure. So, back on The View, you could hear the tension. Host Sonny Hostin tried to jump in multiple times, but the conversation was moving fast and there wasn't much space to examine all these layers. That's one of the problems of issues like this is you can't always fit things into a nice bumper sticker style slogan. And because, we live in a world full of bumper sticker slogans and sound bites, a lot of people they're just too, I guess, dumbed down in order to appreciate the more complex and nuanced nature of these issues. And of course, when you call somebody something like an illegal immigrant, well, that just becomes their master status. You're not supposed to, think about their wants, their needs. Basically, they've become dehumanized and they're just a label at that point. So, at its core, Arnold's message reflects a common belief that belonging comes with responsibility, that people should follow rules, contribute, and show gratitude. And for many people, that feels fair. But for many others, it also feels like an incomplete sort of assessment because it focuses solely on the individual while leaving out the systems that are shaping their choices. And if you're doing that, well, you're dumbing things down. So maybe the real question is not whether immigrants should act like guests. Maybe it's this: who built the house? Who benefits from the way it's run? And who gets to decide who belongs inside? Well, that's it for this episode. If this got you thinking, share it with someone who sees the issue differently, and feel free to like and subscribe and all of that jazz. And yeah, I I don't have anything more to say. Have a good day.